Hello again, 102. In this video, I will go over some of the initial responses in the first few years of the Great Depression as to what was trying to be done to alleviate this huge crisis. And then we'll get into the first New Deal, and then the second New Deal will conclude this particular chapter 23. Initially, the response of Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon would be to liquidate labor, liquidate stocks, liquidate the farmers, liquidate real estate. Letting events run their course, he insisted, would purge the rottenness out of the system. High costs of living and high living will come down. People will work harder and live a more moral life. He is basically taking the conservative, traditional money supply view of the crisis. But with so many people losing jobs and income, consumer and businesses could simply not buy enough goods and services to get the economy going again. And we've talked about that previously. Wages have been stagnant and people can't consume what's being produced. So what did the Hoover administration end up trying to do? Basically, they will finance government construction projects with private initiatives to deal with the crisis. And as the great engineer, he in fact did more than any president had ever done in such dire circumstances. He's working 7 days a week. He's calling multiple conferences at the White House with business leaders, management, labor groups, representatives from agriculture, and he's pleading with industry not to lay more people off and to keep people employed. But these ideas were not good enough, and to finance these government construction jobs, they had a tax increase. And he insisted on trying to balance the federal budget. And this was a huge mistake, because now he's taking even more money out of consumers' pockets. And these higher taxes accelerated the economic slowdown. People had less money to spend when what was the pressed economy needed most was increased consumer spending. And his reaction to the social crisis, which is huge now, this is outside of Seattle, Washington in 1930-31. There's all kinds of shanty towns now existing in most urban areas. Governments cut spending all over, and that worsened the economic situation. All across the country, these shanty towns were sprouting up, as we talked about previously. But still, Hoover refuses to provide any federal programs to help the needy for fear that the nation would be plunged into socialism. And he had laid out his philosophy in his book in the early 20s. And his philosophy was rooted in America's commitment to rugged individualism and self-reliance and free enterprise. And that set firm limits on government action. And he was unwilling to set that philosophy aside, even to meet an unprecedented national emergency. The president still trumpeted the virtues of self-reliance and individual initiative, claiming that government assistance would be the very worst thing for a nation in crisis, for it would rob people of the desire to help themselves. And Hoover hoped the natural generosity of the American people and local charitable organizations would be sufficient to handle the crisis. And he believed that volunteers, the backbone of local charity organizations, would relieve the social distress caused by the Depression. But Hoover's faith in traditional volunteerism was misplaced. Although most Americans tried to get a job earning a living, there weren't any jobs, even for industrious people. The magnitude of the crisis overwhelmed the resources, as we said. And the Salvation Army, churches, the Red Cross are just overwhelmed with needy people. And this led to rising criticism of Hoover. And the Democrats shrewdly exploited his predicament, and in November of 1930s, they gained their first national election victory since 1916, winning a majority in the House and a near majority in the Senate. But still, Hoover refuses to see these political realities, and he still refuses to take any action for direct aid. And he does not want any more federal intervention in the struggling economy. And 25%, as we mentioned, by 1932, 15 million people are unemployed. and still Hoover resisted calls for federal assistance. And there were congressional initiatives that Hoover did support, such as the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, where money was lent to banks and other corporations to help them avoid bankruptcy, and the feeling being then that these firms would then hire people to work. But it was not enough. And he also signed the Emergency Relief Act, which authorized the Reconstruction Finance Corporation to make loans to states for construction projects. And there were protests. Thousands of Midwestern farmers joined the Farmers Holiday Association to protest the low prices that we talked about, the incredibly low prices that they're getting by the early 30s, which we mentioned previously. So they're dumping their food on the ground. Unbelievable. And then there's the Bonus Expeditionary Force that marched on Washington in 1932, demanding immediate payment of their service bonus, which wasn't due to come due until 1945. And there was a violence that ended up happening. The House did pass a bonus bill, but then the Senate voted it down to avoid a tax increase. And then most of the veterans went home. The rest, along with their wives and children, having nowhere to go, they camped in vacant federal buildings, and they constructed a shanty town too at Anacostia Flats, within sight of the nation's Capitol building. This is a travesty at this point. And eager to remove the homeless veterans, Hoover persuaded Congress to pay for their train tickets home, and more left, but others stayed even after Congress adjourned, hoping at least to meet with the president. Late in July, President Hoover ordered the buildings cleared, and in doing so, a policeman panicked and fired into the crowd and killed 2 veterans. The Secretary of War then dispatched 700 soldiers to remove the Bonus Army under the direction of Douglas MacArthur, ironically enough. Using horses, tanks, tear gas, and bayonets, the soldiers dispersed the unarmed veterans and their family, and they burned them out. 55 veterans were injured and 135 arrested. And there is a picture of some of the scuffles that went on with the Bonus Expeditionary Force. And in the 1932 election in June, glum Republicans gathered to renominate Hoover for a second term. And 50-year-old New York Governor Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, won the nomination on the 4th ballot. And in a bold gesture, Roosevelt flew for 9 hours to Chicago to accept the nomination in person instead of waiting for formal notification. No nominee had ever done so. He had broken with tradition, he told delegates, because the stakes were so high. And he went to the podium with his steel braces on his legs, and he made it from his chair about 10 feet, walking with those stiff braces. He forced himself to walk to the podium, and he pretty much won the election right there. And he blamed the Hoover and the Republicans for this terrible economic disaster. I pledge myself to a new deal for the American people, he declared. It would be one that would break foolish traditions and create a new government of competence and courage. Perhaps most important, he recognized that a revitalized economy would require new ideas and aggressive action. The country needs, and unless I mistake its temper, the country demands bold, persistent experimentation. And above all, try something. There were many ways of going forward, Roosevelt explained, but only one way of standing still. And here is the results. A landslide watershed election of 1932. Only Pennsylvania, Delaware, you can't see that, it's cut off. Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, and Connecticut voted for Hoover. This was a landslide victory for the Democrats. And that ends this part of Chapter 23.